Meeting is being recorded.
Yes, so okay, thanks, Lisa.
Here we go. Thank you so much. Thank you, William, for inviting me. Thank you to all of you for being here. It's so lovely to see so many recognizable names. I wish I could just hug you all in person. Thank you for being here. I also want to thank Zoriana Ivashchenko, who let me read her mother's memoir about her grandmother, actress Hanna Babiivna, many, many years ago when I was researching my dissertation. And in many ways, that was sort of the early spark for this project. And then also when I started working more seriously on this book last fall, Pani Zoriana photographed like most every page of this memoir and sent it to me, right? The realities of researching in the time of COVID. So thank you to her. Thank you to all of you for being here. And as William said, this is part of a book project I'm working on called Comrade Actress, Soviet Ukrainian Women on the Stage and Behind the Scenes, which I can give you more details on at the end of the talk, but right now let's just get down to it. So I'm going to share my screen. See if this works. Great, okay. So in a revealing passage in her unpublished memoirs, soon-to-be actress Zosia Sabat describes her courtship with Ukrainian intellectual Fed Fedortsev over the books in his library in 1918 Lviv, today's Lviv. She describes her first encounter with the verses of a phenomenal poet. Fedortsev responds, "Oh, that's Pavlo Tychina, a poet from Great Ukraine." Then Sabat notices authors of whom she's never heard, Dostoevsky, Turgenev, Chernyshevsky. Fedortsev explains, "Those are Russian Democrats." "It's too bad," she responds, "I don't know Russian." This moment with Fedortsev's library opens a window on Sabat's cultural landscape, that of a Ukrainian girl from a Polish-Jewish Ukrainian village, exposed largely to Polish language culture while studying in the big city. Like many, like her, she did not know Russian, had never heard of Dostoevsky, and was not familiar with niche literary trends in the collapsing Russian Empire. But Zosia Sabat would become Sofia Fedortseva, leading actress of the best theater in Soviet Ukraine, the Berezil, survivor of the Soviet century and pensioner in Soviet Lviv. She must have learned Russian. So the first chapter of her memoirs details her relationship with Fedortsev. The second, Evacuation, leaps forward to detail how the Shevchenko Theater, formerly the Berezil, set off towards Central Asia, fleeing the Nazis in 1941. The jump from erudite conversations with Ukrainian intellectuals in Poland to Soviet trains headed east might seem dissonant. In fact, it captures a life, and not only Fedortseva's. So my talk today examines Zosia Sabat, Sofia Fedortseva, and her close friend, Hanna Babiivna, both small-town Galicia girls, who became leading actresses in Soviet Ukraine. And through their story, I want to highlight three larger points. And here they are. So first, the nexus of circulation and gender in theatrical production. The concept of theatrical trade routes, in Christopher Balma and Nick Leonhardt's term, of actresses moving between and inside empires, breaks the geographic categories so persistent in theater history, which divides into Europe, Russia, and various national theater histories. And the recent global turn in theater history obviously contributes to interrogating these categories, but global generally comprises the world created by the Western empires or the decolonizing post-war world, not the multi-ethnic borderlands inside Europe or between Europe and Russia. And the Galicia girls' story is about such movement, from the village to the city, from the empire to the nation, from the periphery to the center, to the camps of the Gulag and back again. The second theme is the role of women in the theatrical avant-garde. Susan Bennett writes of the making of theater history, and she demonstrates that the archive is indeed made according to certain categories that often obscure female labor. Women in Soviet Ukraine worked in children's theater, puppet theater, theater institutes. They switched theatrical companies, or if they stayed with one company, like Babiivna and Fedortseva, they were only actresses. Their work over decades-long careers is rarely caught up in scholarship that largely focuses on directors, on designers, on playwrights. And third, the silences of the archive and the challenge of uncovering everyday lives. Antoinette Burton argues that it is precisely when sources seem slim that we need to dig in and to face, as she writes, coming to grips with how and why the smallness of their work or their worlds illuminates dimensions of the past we need urgently to understand. The archival record offers up few women, yet we know women were there, off stage, on stage, making Soviet Ukrainian culture just like their male counterparts. We need urgently to understand the world of actresses because we cannot otherwise understand the theatrical avant-garde in all its contours, or indeed place the avant-garde in its larger context over the long 20th century. And in Ukraine, this is particularly urgent because most scholarship has focused on what's called the executed renaissance, rozstrelane відродження, of cultural elites, none of whom were women. So in fact, the focus has been on admittedly brilliant and murdered men, but we need to draw on the stories of women who survived and had long careers over the entire Soviet century in order to fully understand theatrical production and reception in Ukraine. So my talk today has 3 sections, and I will begin each section by narrating part of Fedortseva's and Babiivna's biography, and then show how that story engages in these larger theoretical questions of analyzing theater over the 20th century. So part 1, we'll start with theatrical trade routes, and let me begin with the Galician part of the story. So both girls came from villages in Eastern Galicia, in the Habsburg Empire. Sophia came from a priest's family in Rohatin region, Hanna from peasants in Zbaraj region. Both were poor. Both attended teachers' colleges from 1914 to 1918, Hanna in Ternopil, Sophia in Lviv. Both loved theater. So what does this mean? Well, they would have had access to Polish language theater in the cities in which they studied, as well as Ukrainian language itinerant troupes. Both would have seen the Ruska Beseda, which was the premier Ukrainian language itinerant company in the Habsburg Empire, and both eventually worked with members of that company. And in fact, this itinerant Ukrainian language theater proved central to shaping their theatrical worldview. Hanna joined the Ukrainian language Ternopil Dramatic Theater in 1918 after graduating from Teachers College, which was run at the time by actor and director Mykola Ben-Sal. And so Ben-Sal was himself a former member of this Ruska Beseda, this famous Ukrainian language company in the Habsburg Empire. And he had studied with Josip Stadnik, who was perhaps the leading older actor in this theatrical tradition. Yet Ben-Sal had also worked with someone else, with young rising star Les Kurbas, in Kurbas's first theatrical venture, Ternopil Theatrical Evenings, which lasted from 1915 to 1917 during the war. And Kurbas actually left the city in 1916 for bigger and better opportunities in Russian Imperial Kiev. But Ben-Sal took over his troupe, moved to the local Ukrainian language theater, and Babiivna worked with him for 2 years, most likely playing a varied Ukrainian and European repertory for audiences exhausted by war. And so through Ben-Sal, she's getting both this older tradition of itinerant Ukrainian language theater in the Habsburg Empire, and she's also getting exposure to these new ideas with which Les Kurbas was playing in his first company. In 1920, January Bortnik, another small town Galician, walked into a rehearsal, critiqued her acting, and changed her life. Bortnik and his best friend from the Ternopil Ukrainian language high school, Marian Krushelnitsky, had joined Kurbas's company, the Ternopil Theatrical Evenings, in 1915, but they didn't follow him to Russian Imperial Kiev. They stayed behind, working in different Ukrainian language troupes in the collapsing and collapsed Habsburg Empire. At some point in 1920, Bortnik and Babiivna, now married, linked up with Kurbas around Uman, and actually the Polish-Soviet War was taking place in that area at that time. And they continued working with him while the Berezil was formed in 1922 in Kiev, and followed him to Kharkiv, the capital of a new place called Soviet Ukraine in 1926. And indeed, both are considered sort of founding members of the Berezil theater. Sophia had a slightly different path because of her experience with Ukrainian language cultural circles in Lviv. So Hanna leaves for Galicia in 1920, but Sophia stays behind in Lviv, immersed in the milieu of Ukrainian intellectuals around her husband, Fedortsev, who was the editor of a newspaper called Dilo that was very important in Ukrainian language cultural circles in Poland, and he was a major literary figure. Her sister, Maria Swirska, was at this time a rising star in the Polish opera, and her sister's elite artistic circles must have shaped her artistic landscape as well. Sophia graduated from the Lviv Conservatory's Polish Dramatic Studio, started doing amateur readings of Ukrainian verse, and eventually began performing with Stadnik. So again, we have Josip Stadnik's itinerant theatrical troupe around Galicia. And she was seen by Marian Krushelnitsky, Bortnik's best friend, who had at this point joined the Berezil in Soviet Ukraine, but was back home in Galicia, saw Sofia Fedortseva and offered her a contract to join the Berezil Theater in Soviet Ukraine for the 1927-28 season. After discussion with her husband, she chose to leave Poland and move to the Soviet Union. Why? She explains in her memoirs that he was very ill at this time. And in fact, his pro-Ukrainian positions had made it very difficult for him to work in increasingly anti-Ukrainian interwar Poland. And the idea was that actually her paycheck would be helpful for the family's survival. He wasn't working and couldn't make money. And so Fedortseva arrived in Soviet Ukraine in 1927. She left her 3-year-old daughter behind. And after Fedortsev's death in 1930, she had to use apparently all her charms and all her wit to go back to Poland for his funeral in order to bring her daughter back to the Soviet Union, to Soviet Ukraine, to Kharkiv, which she did. So let me pull back a bit to highlight some points in this story of Ukrainian language theater in Galicia. So the world in which these two young women begin their theatrical work is that of itinerant Ukrainian language theater in the Habsburg Empire, performed for entertainment, for nation building, for making a living throughout Galicia, from the small towns to the big cities of Ternopil and Lviv. Now, theater scholars have analyzed Les Kurbas's Galician beginnings and his education actually in Vienna, but other figures that I've mentioned here, Stadnik, Bensal, are rarely discussed except in niche theater journals, yet were clearly instrumental in shaping future artists that I've mentioned here, Krushelnitsky, Bortnik, and of course, Babiivna and Fedortseva. This theater world in which they grew up was minority language theater, under-resourced, shaped by German culture from Vienna and Polish culture from Lviv. And this vector of influence is really important. It means that Polish modernism and German expressionism offered models for good theater far more than, say, the latest trends in the Russian Empire, the realism of Konstantin Stanislavski, or the reactions against that by Vsevolod Meyerhold. So these performers ended up bringing their theatrical worldview to the Soviet Union, to Soviet Ukraine. And I can sort of generalize that as saying this would be a focus on physical and vocal technique, leading to psychological truth as opposed to psychological exercises, and exposure to a specific repertoire that differed from that of the Russian Empire. And so this trade route, right, between Galicia and Soviet Kharkiv was central for the development of theater in Soviet Ukraine. This trade route offered opportunities created by the chaos of war and by the practices excluding minorities in interwar Poland. Galician theater was at the heart of Soviet Ukrainian theatrical innovation. So to pull back a little bit to this discussion of trade routes, and returning to our larger theme of gender and circulation, the story of these Galicia girls highlights what theater historians Melinda Goff and Claire McManus call female theatrical mobility. And I'm really interested in these paradigms of exclusion, how a focus on women in theater can highlight hidden spaces, whether those spaces are geographic, Habsburg Romanov Empire, USSR Poland, these are often studied separately, and yet lives, of course, connected them, or temporal, or formal. And indeed, Hanna's and Sophia's lives crossed these spaces, rarely studied together, and yet it somehow all added up to a career. Baum and Leonhardt highlight the economic aspect of trade routes, showing how entertainment was an inextricable part of empire building. Productions, entrepreneurs, artists traveled along the same routes as goods and imperial officials. Theater was not innocent of empire. But because this work focuses so much on Western European overseas empires, Europe becomes somewhat homogenized, simply a colonizer, a promoter of capitalism. But what about theatrical trade routes within Europe, between the Habsburg and Romanov empires, the Soviet Union and neighboring states, whose roots cannot fully be explained and explored by colonialism and by capitalism? And of course, money is important for shaping theatrical production, but so was Sovietization, nation building, war, occupation. So stories like that of Hanna and Sophia show us how these concepts from global theater history can actually exist within Eastern Europe. And I think how Eastern Europe can contribute to these larger discussions on global theater history by showing the significance of this cross-empire, cross-nation, cross-culture circulation. Okay, so moving on to part 2, women in the avant-garde. By the 1930s, Hanna and Sophia were living in Kharkiv in the House of Specialists, Dim Specialistів. Both were leading actresses at the main theater in the city, the Berezil, where Les Kurbas was the leading theater director. Photos from the time show a happy family with Hanna, January, and their daughter, Dia. January Bortnik at this point was working in different theaters as a director and artistic director, but he was also gainfully employed in the theater. Babiivna had a role in a 1931 production called Comrade Woman, written by all the theater actresses in teams and directed by Valentina Chistakova, director Les Kurbas's wife. It was the only production written or directed by a woman at the Berezil. And my interest lies not in the quality of the production, which I can certainly talk about, but rather in its very existence. Pausing to reflect on Comrade Woman actually highlights the lack of female representation in theater, in repertory, but perhaps more importantly in management and in artistic direction in the early Soviet period. Where is the actress in the theatrical avant-garde? This question is relevant, I would argue, to the entire Soviet Union in the 1920s, but particularly so in Soviet Ukraine, where the world of experimental theater was especially innovative and especially male-dominated. The movers and shakers in 1920s Kharkiv were men. Lists of participants of party meetings, editorial boards, arts workers union meetings clearly show that the authorities making decisions and making art in the new Soviet Ukrainian capital were men. Their world was homosocial. They hunted, they drank, they played billiards. They sat around chatting at writer apartments with fellow members of Vaplita, one of the leading literary organizations. And there's a famous photograph of the 2 rows of unsmiling, very serious Vaplite literary heroes, which attests, I think, very much to the male dominance of the avant-garde. So much of the Soviet 1920s was about constructing the new Soviet woman and about constructing new forms and contents on stage. But that newness seems not to have extended to the representation of Comrade Woman on stage and to reshaping the power structures backstage. And in fact, a focus on actresses suggests somewhat of an exclusionary culture to the revolutionary avant-garde simply by the striking absence of women. Women were certainly engaged professionally in ways previously undreamed of, yet they were not creating the revolutionary narratives representing the new Soviet world around them. Women in the Kharkiv avant-garde were artists in their own right, but often more well known as wives of famous artists. So Chistyakova married to theater innovator Les Kurbas. After Kurbas's arrest in 1933, she continued living with her mother-in-law, with Kurbas's mother. And she continued performing at the theater and eventually teaching in the Theater Institute. In the 1970s, theater scholar Valery Hakebush corresponded with Chistyakova, and the letters are a really wonderful source. But his interest was in Kurbas's productions, what she remembered about certain moments in rehearsal, or how he'd worked with certain parts of the text or come up with certain ideas for productions, not in her own personal experience of this heady era or her life after Curbas's arrest. And indeed, she herself is very reticent to share anything personal or anything of the backstage world in these letters. These stories of actress survival and the afterlife of arrests are not those normally told as part of the era of experimental theater. Our standard narrative of the 1920s revolution in theater in Soviet Ukraine centers around Kurbas and his theatrical genealogy, which I've gone over a little bit earlier, this encounter of Galician itinerant theatrical culture steeped in Polish and German theater with the provincial Russian theater. Together with a group of young people ready to transform theater in Ukrainian, Kurbas, so the narrative goes, created a series of flagship productions we still study today, and we do study them. I wrote a book about them, including those with house playwright Mykola Kulish. Kurbas instituted professionalism, training, quality ensemble work, and he successfully mentored the next generation of artists. Our 20s, nashi 20, in Yarina Tsimbo's phrasing, were indeed a special and unique place, with cultural influences from the West, new figures in authority, new institutions facilitating new cultural developments different from those happening elsewhere. But where are the actresses? And of course, there's lots of biographies of work on Soviet actresses, and there is work examining the larger context, but shockingly little. Now, Wendy Roslin has studied early Russian imperial actresses, Catherine Schuler, late imperial actresses, Lynn Manley, the Komsomolki. Ali Igman has shown how Kyrgyz women fashioned their identities as Soviet Kyrgyz actresses, and Beth Holmgren has written not only about Helena Modajewska, but also shown how gender offers a new take on interwar Polish cabaret. Hanna Babiivna has started this work on gender in Ukrainian theater with a 2018 article that analyzes the shifting ways that women were portrayed on stage in dramaturgy, and very openly querying why actresses have inspired such little scholarship in the region. After all, actresses are much discussed elsewhere, even inspiring a Cambridge Companion in 2007, which is sort of the marker of a validated topic of research. Historians of British theater have very successfully brought gender into scholarly focus, from Tracy Davis's call over 30 years ago to show women as workers in the labor of the theater, up to, for example, Jackie Bratton's revisionist examination of the West End as a place where it was in fact women entrepreneurs managing London entertainment. And Maggie B. Gale's and Kate Dorney's 2019 exhaustive portrait of women in British theater as artists and as business people in the first half of the 20th century. And I sort of want to write like that book for Eastern Europe. Gale and Dorney argue for moving away from a focus on modernism and towards, as they say, the complex and dynamic interplay between different areas of the industry and the workers within it. So in other words, bringing together commercial and non-commercial, artistic, with business, with technical, to capture the wide variety of women's experience. And I think this is a very productive approach. I'm really interested in decomposing the archive in Susan Bennett's phrasing. By decomposing or pulling apart scholars' established categories, Bennett hopes to, as she writes, point up some of those historical categories that underpin a selection of particular kinds of plays to constitute the best representative theatrical work of any period and place. And these best plays, as she shows, are generally written by men. And she's talking about British theater, and she's talking about how women generally wrote comedies and melodrama, Agatha Christie's The Mousetrap, plays that were generally not classified as important by scholars, but that questioning these assumptions about what is best and therefore important shows how, as she says, how significantly our knowledge, which is to say our lack of knowledge, is produced by and through that network of categories. And that's what I think is really important here, is really understanding what are our network of categories for analyzing theater. And I think this argument resonates today. Precisely how and in what capacity women contributed to the explosion of theater from the wartime years through the 1920s is actually not totally taken off as a research focus, And my argument here is not simply showing that, women were there, right? Part of the story, but rather to question this very network of categories that we use to investigate theater. And our network generally focuses on aesthetic innovation and direction. As Charlotte Canning shows, the early 20th century is known as the age of the director, and directors tended to be male. And so scholars tend to categorize theater history according to these male directors. And we see this in Russian and Soviet history as well. We have Stanislavski, and then we have Meyerhold, we have Vakhtangov, right? Which misses any women involved. And moreover, in Ukraine, as in other post-Soviet countries as well, the political reality of the state created certain parameters that have very much shaped the archive. Kurbas, as an artist murdered by the Soviet state, could not possibly have an official state archival collection in the Central State Archive of Literature and Art, even though by the time it opened in 1966, he was rehabilitated. But now, Kurbas, precisely because of that, because he was an artist murdered by the totalitarian state, actually serves as an organizing principle for all work on theater of the period. And so anyone connected with Kurbas suddenly becomes important and archive worthy. But what about everyone else? And indeed, the revolution and ensuing war created many opportunities for women to leave their previously prescribed life paths and join the theater. Women entered professional careers in the theater in ways they could not have dreamed of in the days of the Russian Empire. And these women have generally only been researched and discussed and highlighted as part of Kurbas's companies. But when we expand our sightlines beyond, say, experimental theater, we see the myriad ways women were able to professionalize. So of course, actresses Hanna Babiivna and Sofia Fedortseva entered the professional theater in the Habsburg Empire, but there were many others who started their careers with Kurbas and ended up working elsewhere. The Soviet state funded theater for young spectators, puppet theater, theater institutes, and it was often women who ran them. Let me give you a few examples. Actress Irina Dayeva never worked with Kurbas, and so she actually never shows up in a lot of this work on revolutionary and experimental theater in Soviet Ukraine. Yet she not only assisted Konstantin Marjana in his legendary 1919 Fuente Ovohuna in Kiev, there's a lot of work on that production, but she also crafted the entire training program for the Soviet Polish theater, which was the only Polish language theater in the entire Soviet Union, and she designed the entire training program for the theater. She also founded the Kiev Theater for Young Spectators. Or take Zinaida Pihulovich. She's the one woman in the center here in this photograph. She was the only woman to ever participate in Kurbas's directing lab. And she sort of states in this offhand way in a memoir, I couldn't move to Kharkiv in 1926 with Berezil because I was about to become a mother. So how her pregnancy affected her ability to join Berezil remains unclear. But she ended up running the Berezil second studio, one of its affiliates, with her husband, director Faust Lopotinsky. She studied in Moscow, and she founded a small forms theater under the Kiev Theater for Young Spectators. She also founded a puppet theater, and she herself made puppets. Oh, and she also starred in films in 1920s Odessa. At some point, she and Lopotinsky split. He was arrested and shot, but she survived. And after the war, she ran a theater in Mykolaiv. And I could go on with a myriad of examples. So looking at revolutionary theater through the lens of the actress highlights the legions of, if you will, comrade actress entering the theater. They may have begun their path with Kurbas, maybe training in his studio, acting in one of his productions, but their careers then ranged far beyond him because of the plethora of jobs created by the Soviet state. This was indeed a professional revolution. Yet scholarship focusing on exclusively avant-garde, exclusively directorial innovation, on Kurbas does not catch their stories. And here we move to the next section, the silence of the archive. And this is a quote from Hanna Babiivna in a memoir piece about Sofia Fedortseva, her aunt, whom she called Sonechko. And she's explaining here why there's so much personal information that she simply does not know about her aunt or indeed about her own mother. So let me return to Hanna's and Sofia's biographies. On September 28th, 1937, January Bortnik was arrested. He was shot on January 16th, 1938, but Hanna did not learn about this fact until August 1956. She was asked to denounce her husband publicly, but she refused. In her manuscript memoir, Spovet pro mamu, Dia Babiivna records that her mother was playing in Trnyov's Lubov Yerovaya at the time when her husband was arrested. And in the play, there's a moment where Lubov denounces her husband, and then her husband is arrested. And during the show, Babiivna played the moment in an unexpected way. Even though the character wanted the arrest of the faithless husband, still she sort of wept bitterly, right? Sort of falling apart in tears on stage. And in fact, the secret police interrogated Babiivna after the show because her acting choices suggested that she was protesting the arrest of her own husband, or at least reacting to his arrest. In other words, they thought off stage affected on stage. But actually, this was just her rather brilliant choice for the play that she had created during rehearsals. Yet the memoir suggests the irony of this coincidence, that the everyday tragedies of life as an actress in the Soviet century could be reflected on stage. And it's this everyday aspect that is so difficult to access in these stories. On May 11th, 1938, the two friends were coming back from the theater, where Sophia had just performed. Hanna at this point was not allowed to perform. They saw the black cars waiting outside the house, and they assumed correctly that the cars were there for Hanna. After all, her husband had been arrested. And they decided that they would try to convince the NKVD agents that Dia was Sophia's daughter so they wouldn't be separated. And they almost got away with it until the agent's superior showed up and refused to go along with the ruse. Sophia then woke Dia up to tell her that her mother was going on a long tour and that she should go peacefully with the two men. Sophia then spent the next 2 years trying to find Dia. Where had she gone? Trying to track her down. And eventually found her in an orphanage actually right outside Kharkiv. She went to visit her, to check on her and see how she was doing, but she did not send Dia's photograph to Hanna, serving 5 years in Mordovia and desperate for news of her daughter, because Dia looked so terrible and so sad. When the Nazis invaded in 1941, Dia's orphanage was evacuated to Kazakhstan, and by whim of fate, when Hanna was freed in 1943, after serving her 5 years, she was actually able to link up with her daughter's orphanage in exile and stayed with them. She sewed buttons on clothes. She had no teeth. She had lost them all in the camps. Dia writes of how strange her relationship with her mother was. Hanna suffered, of course, from what we would call today post-traumatic stress disorder. She told her daughter that she wished she had died when in 1936, Dia, had been hit by a car as she was crossing the street. And Hanna said, "I wish you died in this accident because I wouldn't have survived the grief, and then neither of us would be here suffering in Central Asia." But they survived, and the war ended. Back in Kharkiv and returned not from exile, but from evacuation in Central Asia, Sophia, right, who'd been evacuated as a leading actress with this leading theater, urged Marian Krushelnitsky, who was now running the theater, to push Khrushchev to reinstate Hanna on the theater's roster after the war. And this was highly inappropriate, not what anyone was supposed to do, but the effort was successful. And Hanna and Dia returned to Kharkiv and to a huge communal apartment full of actors. And in fact, Hanna was reinstated as an actress of the first category, which had been her status before her arrest, even though she really could not perform her former roles. When Krushelnitsky left Kharkiv to run the Ivan Franko Theater in Kiev, Hanna was sort of shuffled around between statuses, actress of the first, of the second, of the third, of the first category, but she stayed at the theater her entire career and died in 1979. Sophia actually retired and left both the theater and Kharkiv in 1960. She returned to Lviv, back home, where Dia often visited her. Sophia and Hanna remained in touch and appear to have been close. Yet Dia writes of how there was always something unspoken between the two friends, because why was Sophia never arrested? Had she done anything that could have led to the arrest of January Bortnik, her best friend's husband. And indeed, she'd won an Order of Lenin for her work in the theater. So why did one friend win a prize and enjoy a storied career, and the other was sent to the camps? Sophia passed away in 1988. Dia eventually went to read her father's arrest file in 1994, and she was prepared to learn the worst about her beloved Sonichko. But there was nothing. There was absolutely nothing in Sophia's comments that would in any way suggest any sort of donos of any kind. In other words, the silent suspicion that had existed between the two friends for so long was for nothing. Sophia just escaped arrest, that's all. She had in fact supported her friend tirelessly. She had found her daughter. She had secured her job after the war. The Soviet state was simply irrational in its choice of victims. And this story is so typical, right? And in a way so unsurprising for the Stalinist era, for Stalinist theater, in the way that silences do become a part of friendship, and the way the Soviet state does reach all the way into the relationship between two women. But let me highlight some of the archival silences here. And this is important because actually sources abound for the avant-garde in Ukraine. There's reviews, there's photographs, there's journal articles about theater productions. But moreover, apparatchiks discussed theater productions at the highest levels, the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the Politburo. Soviet Ukrainian Politburo meetings touch on theater and literature and artists. And artists, directors, and managers, as well as lower level officials, wrote in constantly to the Central Committee with queries, with complaints, with petitions. Very rarely did these touch on women, however. The issues were generally on directing, on repertory, and renegade male artists. Women were discussed less and certainly not doing any of the discussing. Nor, of course, does the State Archive touch on everyday life, the world backstage. Memoirs, letters, personal collections can, of course, fill this gap, yet they too are often organized around aesthetic innovation and, as Hanna Babiivna notes here, often do not illuminate mysteries relevant and interesting to the contemporary scholar. For example, the children of Brazil are completely understudied. Simple questions like, did actresses take maternity leave, are unknown. Why didn't Pichulovich go to Kharkiv in 1926 when she was pregnant? Why did Nadia Titarenko, who had 3 children, including twins, with director Volodymyr Sklerenko, leave the stage? When did Fedortseva's daughter move to England? How? Why? And these family relationships are particularly potent in Hanna's and Sofia's story because, of course, they both left family members behind in Poland when they moved to the Soviet Union. And those family members who were in Eastern Galicia then became wrapped up and part of the Soviet Union and Soviet Ukraine after the war. And here's an example. Fedortseva writes a memoir essay in the 1970s about her sister. You remember her sister, this Polish opera singer, Maria Sabatswirska. She has her own very interesting story unfold in Poland. And Fedortseva writes, so this is the 1970s, that she lost her connection with her sister in 1927 because she left Galicia. And she writes, after an entire artistic life, I returned to Lviv and we picked up our relationship. So that's 33 years they were not in touch, and then they pick up their relationship. It's a wonderful story, and it's not impossible for the Soviet century, but it doesn't seem to be true. There's another post-Soviet memoir by, I think, her son or daughter-in-law, that Fedortseva was actually responsible for her sister's survival in the anti-Polish atmosphere in post-war Lviv. In other words, she was considered a Polish opera singer. Her second husband was Ukrainian and had been arrested. And in fact, she apparently traveled all the way from Lviv to her sister, Sofia Fedortseva, who's a people's artist of Ukraine, in Kharkiv in order to avoid arrest. And so if that's true, then clearly in the late Soviet period, Fedortseva did not feel she could share such a story, right? And yet the lives of these sisters, and their third sister, Irina, by the way, who worked in the administrative offices of Lviv Conservatory after the war, reflect so much the story of theatrical trade routes, of bringing women into focus, and the necessity of exploring the archival silences. And the story of the Berezio, often told as an artistic achievement and a tragedy, generally glosses over Hanna's story. The tragedy, and it was a tragedy to be sure, of Kurbas and playwright Mykola Kulish, shot together in 1937, generally takes center stage, leaving Hanna Babiivna, who was only arrested and sent to the Gulag, out of the frame. And it's in fact that trade route, that circulation to the Gulag and the camps and back again, that's missing. And we so rarely talk about the survivors of this period, only those executed. And what if we centered the story of the theatrical avant-garde not on Kurbas and Kulish, famous, fabulous, murdered, but on Hanna and Sophia, who experienced the full weight of the Soviet century and who were intimately connected with the theater on stage and off, from Habsburg childhoods to Soviet old age. I think our narrative of theater across the Soviet century would then shift. And I'll end with this. How would it shift? I believe this shift would highlight the specificity of Ukraine, this borderland region that is central to connecting the Habsburg and Romanov empires, Poland and the Soviet Union, now caught between Russia and the EU. And this is a place particularly shaped by that connecting, as a place of war, a place of occupation, a place of cross-cultural circulation. And I believe, second, that a focus on actresses circulating on theatrical trade routes would highlight the work, the labor of the theater. After all, Sophia went to Kharkiv not only because she wanted to work with Kurbas, who wouldn't, but also because she needed the money. And it was her labor, her work, her energy that saved Hanna and Dia and apparently her own sister. And survival meant years of work, years and years of rehearsals, of performances, a life spent backstage in rehearsal rooms working. And in many ways, theater history is dominated by the directorial innovations that shape the course of theatrical development, but it's often actresses and their work embodying these innovations and making them consequential. And finally, shifting our network of categories in what we deem worthy of study in theater can highlight both the gendered nature of Soviet theater, where women were rarely in positions of artistic authority, and therefore the ways that theater represented or failed to represent Soviet society. And yet, continuing to explore the silences, what is unsaid, the gaps in the archive, suggests that the avant-garde was only one story in a much longer and larger story of theater as a part of everyday life, in careers that spanned the Habsburg Empire, Poland, and the Soviet Union, and in survival across the Soviet century in Ukraine. And this is what I hope to show in my larger book project, which actually ends with a chapter on contemporary Ukraine, which is fascinating because it is quite striking how so many women today in Ukraine are actually involved in theater, not only as actresses, but actually in positions of management and artistic direction. They're some of the movers and shakers. And I think it's worth giving some thought to both why that is the case now and putting that into this sort of larger story of the longue durée of women in theater. So thank you very much for listening to all of that. And I look forward to talking with you more about actresses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayhill. This was such a fabulous talk and really, really rich and inspiring and sort of uncovered, just opened my eyes to theatre in a completely different way.
Good.
And especially theatre of this period, which is so interesting. Oh, you froze for a second there, but you seem to be back.
Okay. Good.
I mean, I have lots and lots of questions, and I will start with a question. But please, everybody who's here, please do think of your questions, and you can either just, I think, put your hand up using the hand function, or you can write your question in the chat, and I'll try to keep a track of that as well. But I think I was really interested to hear you talk about these women who were moving from sort of the Polish theatre, or sort of had their roots really in the Habsburg Empire even,
yeah.
And moving to a completely different, to a different state, to a different theatrical world, to a different sort of theatrical tradition. And this is something that comes up in your work on Kurbas as well, and it's something that makes him so interesting. You know, this kind of Vienna educated, kind of very much Central European director, shaped by his Central European experience, and then coming and just kind of shaking up Soviet theatre so interestingly. And I was wondering, had you come across in some way how those artists, directors or actors, actresses who came from across the Western border into Soviet theatre, Soviet Ukrainian theatre, how they were perceived by their colleagues? You know, were they seen as people bringing exciting modern European ideas? You know, because obviously at that time in that milieu, cultural milieu in Ukraine, sort of Europeanness and being European was very important. You had the whole slogan, you know, Khrushchev's famous slogan of, you know, get away from Moscow and kind of turn to Europe and all of that stuff. So, or were they seen maybe in a different way, maybe as you know, the two actresses who came from kind of provincial Galicia, were they seen as maybe more provincial in some way than, you know, the sort of Kharkiv theatrical world was used to? I don't know. So I'd be really curious to hear if you came across anything about how they were perceived when they moved.
Yeah. So that's a fabulous question, and what's so interesting is, so I have an answer and then not an answer. So the answer is, I can tell you how men were perceived, and I can even like cite my own book, right? That there's a lot of examples of both kinds of reactions that you're talking about. That people were so eager for Kurbas's ideas. When he goes to Germany at one point, and they all go to Poland at one point, and the talks that he gives, I mean, people love it, right? They're hungry for new influences. But at the same time, yes, there are, we have some evidence of Semenko, for example, says, you know, oh, in your orangerie, you're the only pan or something, you know, some very derisive comment about Kurbas. And there are sort of definitely some kind of, you know, who do these people think they are, right? About that group. But about women, I don't know. I really don't know. And that is sort of about this project that is so fascinating, is how much you don't know. And if people aren't showing up in a lot of these state archival documents, and if people aren't talking about, you know, their inner feelings in letters or memoirs, it's very hard to tell. And, you know, certainly it seems like this group of women in Berezil were close. They were spending all this time together. They were rehearsing all the time. They were friends. We have a lot of letters later in their life where they mention, you know, very sweetly, oh, have you heard of what's happening to her? Have you heard of her daughter? I'm so worried about her. So I think we can assume that they were close and connected. But whether anyone thought at any point, you know, I love that, oh God, these provincial girls, you know, I don't know. They certainly could have, right? I mean, some of these, Zinaida Picholovich went to medical school in Kiev, right? So someone who went to medical school in Kiev and someone who went to, you know, teachers college in Ternopil, I mean, you know, but again, I don't have that evidence. It's really missing.
One of those silences, I guess.
Yeah.
So do we have any questions from our audience for Mayhill? I can't believe there are no questions after all that.
Yes, François Xavier. Oh my God, hi.
Yeah, hi.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. It's great, very fascinating. And I'm very interested in your third part. I mean, about the silence.
Yeah.
And well, I buy the point. I mean, it's very interesting, but still, I'm wondering how you can work on this.
Yeah.
What kind of sources? I mean, there's something very interesting in it. I mean, to work on the survivors.
Yeah.
On the people going through the purges, going through the war, and then working back again.
Yeah.
And you're right, there's obviously a gender dimension to it, because we all know the gender dimension of the Stalinist terror.
Yeah.
But if I'm okay, I'm 100%, but how are you going to work on it? With what kind of sources? I mean, only memoirs, or just, I can't figure out,
So yes, so great question. And one, any ideas, let me know. But two, actually, I do have some ideas. And I mentioned this woman, Irina Dayeva. And Hanna Babiivna, who's a theater scholar in Ukraine, wrote a short piece about her. And I went through my documents from my research and actually realized that she had done this stuff with the Polish theater. So she is in the archive, actually. She is. And I think there are some archival traces that just take more tracking down. There's another woman, Sofia Manulovich, who was in Odessa for a long time. She's somewhere in Odessa. I mean, whether it's the filiale of the Arts Workers Union in Odessa, or whether it's the theater archives in Odessa, she's gotta be there, right? So it is just spending some time to sort of pull that out. And I think, and that work can be done. But I also think there is a larger point about this sort of what people didn't talk about, and what you don't know and what you can never know. And maybe there's something about being a scholar of this period, or a scholar of theater of this period, that you have to reckon with that. And that as scholars, we're never going to know everything. And so then what do we do? And then how do we try to approximate that story while respecting that archival silence? How do we bring people back into the story, knowing full well that we're never going to know the 360-degree story of their lives? I think there's something really important about that. So I would say, yes, I think there's more one can find out, but I also think that acknowledging that silence and figuring out how to tell the story while still respecting what you can never know is important.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions?
Olesya.
Yes, Olesya.
Hi, Mayhill. That was so fascinating. It was so wonderful to listen to your talk. I on the sources, because I have a similar dilemma. I mean, I'm lucky I was able to interview some of the women because they were just about still alive, but elderly in the 90s. But still, you know, there's this idea. Well, how do you write about people who left no trace, supposedly, right? In my case, service women. But the silence that you talked about is a story enough, isn't it? I mean, the fact that they don't appear what we'd expect them to, or there aren't sources that men have left behind, seem to me like that there's a book that has to be written about that. That, you know, where are these women? Why aren't they there? The question I had to you, something that completely blew my mind when you were talking about the performance being perceived as a reaction to real life event, and I wonder whether that's gendered at all. Whether you found examples of men, also male actors, also being potentially arrested or interrogated because they gave us a particular type of performance.
Yeah, so I haven't found examples from male performances, and actually, I have found. I mean, now that you asked me that question, and I'm sort of thinking about it, often very obviously, we who act know that you use your life to do your work, right? We know that. But actually, I've found very few archival, again, written down examples of people talking openly about that, right? So for example, in my book, actually, I talk about a play, Diktatura, Dictatorship, by Ivan Mikatenko, which is about collectivization, basically, gathering the grain. And, you know, the people involved in that play, obviously they knew what was going on, right? I mean, they knew, but in none of the sort of memoir or letters or anything does anyone talk about, well, you know, when I went and I remembered this and I used that in my work for this. They don't talk about that, which is actually why this moment did strike me so much, because obviously these secret police guys were like, oh God, she is really upset, you know. And it's sort of wonderful that it wasn't. It was just a brilliant moment of acting. So I think, again, that's maybe an interesting moment of silence too, that this sort of connection between how I use my life and into my work is actually very hard to figure out. It's very hard sometimes to make that connection. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, that story was really striking as well. Really, I found that really a really amazing sort of anecdote about that. That's a real life situation being reflected in the performance in some way, and then that being, you know, noticed by the police, and
yeah,
really, really fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, do we have any other questions? I mean,
I have things in the chat. I can unmute.
So I'll let our audience think a little bit more. But I was also really interested how you talked about at the beginning about this, the whole paradigm of the executed Renaissance, yeah, that I was doing about Virginia, and how that concept has really shaped the way that we see the Ukrainian culture of that Soviet Ukrainian culture of the sort of 20s into the 30s. And, you know, and a concept that comes, and a term that comes about some, you know, quite a lot later. Obviously, but casts what was really, you know, a period when Ukrainian culture was not really orientating itself so much towards the kind of that sort of martyrological Shevchenko type cultural figure. Yeah, you had poets like Semenko and others who were just kind of rejecting that in the context of the avant-garde, and kind of being much more about, you know, art and life, and, you know, and not kind of having to be a martyr for the nation. And then but they are then seen through that paradigm. They're kind of subsumed into that paradigm. These artists who their work was not really part of that kind of way of producing culture. And in that sense, you know, it was striking that you've talked about a couple of survivors, who, by definition, can't be those martyrs. They can't be those martyr figures, and they sort of fall out of that. You know, so I wondered if that's something that we have to think a bit more about when we when we look at this period of the 20s, the 30s, early Soviet culture, you know, and try to sort of unpick and peel away that kind of film of martyrdom through which we see it.
Yes, I like 100% agree. I think that, you know, and Halina Khin has written about how problematic that term is. And I think it's a very problematic term. I think, and to me, what's always so funny is I think when you look at all of these guys, probably a lot of them would hate that they were put in the same category together. You know what I mean? They'd be like, I don't want to be in the same category with that person. They're all very different. There's tensions in that group. They're not one group, right? And yet this category sort of makes them all martyrs and makes them all sort of in this tragic light. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Semenko, Johansson, Khmelyevi, I mean, they were not at all about sort of martyrdom, right? And not even about the nation necessarily. So I do think it's a problematic term, and I do think that it cuts out a lot. You know, it not only cuts out famous survivors we know of, right? Like Yuri Smolich, for example, right? Or Vishnya, right? Who survives. But it cuts out women. I mean, there are no women in the executed Renaissance. And so then we're really missing this whole part of the story. And I do think that's a problem in the way that scholars of Ukraine have conceptualized this period. And I did this in my own book, right? There's very few women in my book, right? But I think that, again, to take a holistic view, we really need to bring in more stories. And I also think there's something about this fixation on the executed Renaissance and on this period that could use some thought. And I think by thinking about these survivors, many women who survived, you do get this longue durée picture. And actually the 1920s becomes just a decade, right? And then there were other decades with interesting developments and different developments that were part of one whole long career. And by focusing so much, I think, on this one sort of, it's not a blip, right? But a short period, we miss this longer story, you know, and sort of some of these questions of, you know, well, what was it like for Babiivna coming back from the Gulag? How did her work change? How did people who'd studied with Kurbas change his technique, change his ideas in the 50s or 60s, right? I mean, they probably didn't keep doing the exact same thing. So how did it change over time, right? And I think we miss those questions. We miss those, that sort of that longue durée by just focusing so much on the 1920s. Yeah, so I would agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, the whole question of the survivors is a complicated one, because I mean, we also have figures like Tychina and Bajan, you know, who I mean, it's interesting that the anthology Rastlenia Vidrozhnia, the original anthology, does have Tychina in it, for example. Has some people who were not executed,
right?
But they're all men, you know, whether they survived or not. But it sort of made me think of other artists from that period and from the West as well, because obviously that's the artists, the writers who were executed were obviously in the Soviet part, and then you have the expansion into Western Ukraine, and you also have writers and artists who are then being incorporated, who were working in the 30s and then are then working in the Soviet Union. So there's really interest, you know, the case of the artist group in Lviv, the Avant-garde group, and artists like the Shelskis, who are doing this very interesting avant-garde art in the 20s, but then work within Soviet art, and you know, after the war as well, and have careers in the Soviet Union. And those stories we sort of think of it as a break.
But it's not exactly. But it's not a break, right? And sort of looking at, I mean, this story of, for example, the Sabat sisters, right? So Sofia Fedortseva becomes this people's artist of Soviet Ukraine, and her sister's a Polish opera singer, right? Obviously knew the artist group, right? And through this one family, you actually connect all of these different artistic trends. And there's this photograph in this memoir essay that details how Fedortseva sort of saved her sister, of the three sisters. So Sophia, Maria, the opera singer, and Irina, the accountant at the Lviv Conservatory, all like hiking in the Carpathians together, right? So it's one family, one set of siblings, and they bring all of this stuff together that you're absolutely right, we study separately, right? We study Polish artistic trends and Artes and, you know, Bruno Schulz over here, and we study, you know, Soviet culture over here, and actually these lives connected them.
Yeah, I mean, and that it's this argument you make in your book also for the kind of borderlands as a way to understand, and the kind of difference of geographical imagination helps us to look at that. And you know, if you would think of a borderland and the things that are on one side and things that are on the other, and that the way that border can actually shift, and those people can shift, and they are okay, they're in different states at different times, they're in different sort of national traditions at different times, but then exactly, like they're crossing over. They have contacts with people who are working in other languages and other traditions or in other states, and it's just so characteristic of Ukraine.
Exactly.
It's kind of it's just invisible. So, you know, this is why I loved your book, you know, and I love this presentation, because it brings these things. It kind of reveals all these connections and like these kind of trade routes, like you said.
Thank you. Great.
So, any other questions?
I mean, we can talk forever about, you know, how great Ukraine is, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian theater.
May I?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you tell us more about this play about Tavarish Zhenshin?
Yes.
Because, you know, you just say it, just like very interesting. What's about? And
yeah, so it's totally fascinating. So first of all, it is called Tovarish Zhenshina, and I just wrote an article about it that's actually translated into Ukrainian, and I had this long discussion with the translator, because she was like, it's Ukrainian, it should be Tovarish Zhinka, not zhenshina. And I was like, no, but the play is zhenshina. The play is about a zhenshina. So how interesting. But it was written for March 8th, for International Women's Day. And the actresses sort of brought it together by doing improv work that then was kind of shaped into, I think it's about 13 sort of set pieces. And there are 3 sort of plots that are quite schematic. So one is about a woman who is called to go to the village to help with collectivization, but what's she going to do with her daughter who's sick? So like that sort of, you know, she has this long monologue, am I a mother or a leader of the Komsomol? So that's kind of one plot. The other plot is sort of a challenges in the factory, and there's sort of some issue with women in the factory. And then the other is actually what's happening in the village, right? And kind of coming together to make the collective farm in the village. And it is quite schematic. Critics complained that it was too schematic, that it was not like the best of Berezil production because of that. But it had, we can tell from photographs, a lot of group work. So a lot of kind of physicality and group work, creating these scenes, creating the factory, creating the village. It had a lot of great acting. An actor, Josip Hirniak, played this character who is supposed to be very old school and sort of, it's an anachronistic term, but misogynist. So he's sort of talking about like comrade women, and it's, you know, it's so bad that women have to give birth and have to have children because biologically it means that things are so hard for them. And when he gives this talk, actually women raise their hand and they say, but don't you know how great socialism has been? Socialism's amazing for women, and how many women have become literate in Kharkiv, and how many people are in city council, and how many people are doing this, and you know nothing. So it was not performed for a long time, this play. It was performed in that season, and then it didn't come back. It is definitely not the best play ever written, but I think it's fascinating because it really is the only play written by women at the time. And I think actually, if you really look at even the schematic play, you see some real issues, like this issue of, am I a mother or a Komsomol leader? This issue of leaving your daughter. And actually this moment where Dia Babiivna was almost killed by a car, her mother, Hanna Babiivna, was out of town with the theater at the time. And I think it's interesting that she was out of town, and then it becomes this event that recurs in her mind. Obviously that was very traumatic, being away from her child when her child almost died, right? So, and this issue of you know, women and socialism, which obviously recaps this idea that yes, socialism was good for women, but again, we don't know anything about these Berezil women, and they aren't featured, and they aren't in theater management, and they aren't in theater direction. So, so what is that story? So I wonder if, yes, it's a very schematic play, but there isn't some kind of, some little kernels of truth at the heart of it, right? That come out of what these actresses sort of thought was important to talk about for Women's Day. So, yeah, that's what I can say about Comrade Woman. But it is actually really quite fascinating when you sort of look at it more.
So we don't have any other questions yet, but maybe I'll ask you about the question related to the title of that play, and this question of, is it Zhenshina or Zhinka? And I was wondering about the question of language in the sort of theatre world in Kharkiv, and for example, the 2 women that you talk about who were coming from Poland,
yeah,
so presumably sort of more comfortable in Ukrainian, Polish, potentially German. Yeah. and not necessarily so much in Russian, for example. So did you come across sort of any problems with them using the Russian language, or for example, you know, coming to Kharkiv where people speak a different kind of Ukrainian? You know, is there any sort of trace of that there? I'm just sort of wondering what kind of languages you come across in the archive.
Yeah, so both of them show up only in Ukrainian. Obviously on all their ankiety, they mention they know Polish. I've never come across anyone sort of complaining about their language at all. What I have come across is, for example, Vasil Vasilko, who's a Ukrainian director, but from the Russian Empire, complaining in the 1920s about his actors who can't speak good Ukrainian on stage. So this is, his complaint is, oh my gosh, in the Russian Empire, we can't speak good stage Ukrainian. And certainly Maria Zenkovetska, who's a 19th century diva actress from the Russian Empire. She's totally fabulous and wonderful, so interesting. Famous in the Russian Empire. Darwin actually photographed her. She was on tour, even though Ukrainian language theater was prohibited. They performed for the Tsar in the 1890s, who loved them. And at that time, Darwin photographed her for, I guess, the Russian version of his book. Anyways, but she goes on tour to Galicia, and she makes some very funny comments about, like, it's not Ukrainian, right, that they're speaking. So obviously there's some dialect problem there, but I've never come across, for these women in the Soviet period, I've never come across anything like that. But it's a good question, and actually, of course, you know, this I started this talk with this sort of, Fedortseva didn't know Russian, and obviously she learned Russian, right? And we know, of course, that particularly by the later Soviet period, of course they were speaking Russian, right? But yes, we know they also knew Ukrainian. We know they also knew Polish, and so they were living in much more of a multilingual world, I think, than we might imagine, right? Never mind the Yiddish, right? I mean, one of the other actresses I'm looking at in this book project is Leah Bukova, who is an actress in the Yiddish theater, and then is in some military theater during the war. And then she joins the Russian language theater in Odessa and becomes a very big kind of social figure in the Odessa, and in the Odessa theater world. And so, you know, you sort of imagine her linguistic world, right? Which is Yiddish and Russian. Obviously she knew Ukrainian. So I think this multilingualism, right, is really important. A lot of your work is on this, right? And sort of how do you kind of capture that as a scholar in our imagination? I think that's a great question.
Yeah. So we have still about 13 minutes, 12 minutes or so. If anyone's got a question they've been saving up and too afraid to ask, now is the moment. But I want maybe to change the topic a little bit, and I suspect this might also be another question where the answer is, I don't know, because it's not in the archives and there's no evidence of it. But it's to do with, I suppose, thinking about the relation, women working in the theatre, relationship between men and women within the theatre milieu, directors and actresses, the kind of power dynamics.
Yeah.
And also, you know, that sort of raises the question of, you know, the sort of Me Too question. Yeah. And you know, it was noticeable when that whole thing kind of exploded in a couple of years ago. It came out of well, film cinema really, but you know, I think the theatre is an atmosphere where those kind of things happen. You know, because it's a very specific kind of environment. Yeah. And I just wondered is that anything that you've come across? Is there any trace of those kind of problems in what you looked at?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And actually in Ukraine, now there's sort of a big discussion about насилие в театре, right? Yeah. Violence in theater. And there's been quite a bit of discussion about what it means to be an actress. One actress, Oksana Cherkashina, sort of went public with, you know, what this director had sort of mistakenly assumed that being an actress meant you were a prostitute, right? And so that sort of started this whole discussion about nasilia and kind of what it means to be a woman in theater. It's really, really interesting and I think very important discussion. And there's a lot of, I think, really interesting people working in theater in Ukraine right now, kind of having those conversations, right? What does it mean to be a woman on stage? You know, what is it? How are we talking about the war and women, right? How are we representing women on stage, representing war? So that's a very interesting conversation right now. And I think it's really important actually to think about, well, are we missing those stories and those questions from our historical research, right? And there was a really interesting piece in, oh my gosh, the American Historical Association like journal that we get, whatever, but about a woman working, a scholar whose name I can't remember, but working in Asian history. And she wrote this really beautiful piece about how she'd been writing about this, I think like 16th century story, and I'm gonna get the details wrong, but say in China, about this woman for years. And she said, you know, it's only now that I realized this was a story of rape and that this woman, why didn't I believe her narrative kind of? And why as a scholar and a female scholar, did I not kind of see what was really going on in this 16th century story? And it's a really interesting piece. And I think it does kind of beg that question. And I certainly don't have any evidence or direct answer for you. You know, I do think that this is why it's important to get beyond this sort of martyrological, hagiographic way of talking about the 20s and 30s. I mean, I think, for example, I think it was very hard to be an actress in Berezil, in Curbas's companies. I mean, they had rehearsals like the show went till midnight and then they'd rehearse again, you know, and he could be very, very harsh with people. And I think that kind of, you know, obviously for people, it was still this transformative place and they remember it as this, you know, beautiful moment in their careers. But I think, yeah, I think it's important to think about, well, what really were the power dynamics at work there? And what really were the contours of how people could grow and how people could explore themselves? I think that's a really interesting question. And I think too, the ways that women are often, I have come across many examples of women very much being discussed in this sort of prostitute / whore discourse, who are actresses. And this Valentina Chistakova, I mean, I remember one theater scholar telling me that, you know, Chistakova was, you know, she was sleeping around, she was a terrible person, you know, Curbas wasn't enough for her, you know, what a terrible person. And, you know, I mean, I don't know whether she was having an affair. She doesn't seem like a terrible person, but like, who cares, right? Like, why was that this woman's obsession? Like, oh, she slept around, right? She's horrible. And one finds that kind of quite a bit. There's another actress, Natalia Ujvi, who was married for a while to Semenko, right? And Semenko's kids, I mean, his son, Rostislav, kind of can't believe that Ujvi didn't denounce Semenko. And even there's, in the archives, there's even these like letters from the KGB who are like, I told him, read the file, there's nothing there. And Rostislav is like, no, the actress did it, the actress denounced him. And they're like, no, actually, she really didn't do that. But that sort of, you know, anti-theatrical prejudice, right? That idea that like to be an actress, to be a performer, to be revealed on stage makes you somehow suspect, right? And definitely we see that kind of, I think not only at the time, but very much in the scholarship afterwards. Like I'm saying, I mean, this is nothing, I can't give you any sort of super smart analytic response, but I can say I've come across so many sort of derogatory comments about some of my historical subjects, right? About Chistakova or Ujvi, or, women were sleeping with NKVD agents, so of course they didn't get arrested. How do you know that? Right? So there is.
It reminds me of reading it. Yeah, it reminds me of reading about Raisa Troyanka.
Yes.
The poet, the Jewish Ukrainian poet, very kind of unusual phenomenon at that time. And one of the things that, there's not a lot of material, I think, about her around, and not an awful lot is known, but when you do read articles about her, it's often mentioned, oh yeah, she was famous for sleeping around.
Yeah,
and she's sort of the only, when you kind of look
at, she was really famous for sleeping around, but she was also a poet. And I'm like, why, why do we not do that with Simon Cohen Johansson, right?
Exactly. Who I think were up to similar things. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So on that note.
On that note.
So thank you so much for such a really inspiring and rich talk. I really look forward to the book coming out, and encourage everybody to read your other book, Beaumont and Empire's Edge. And yeah, thank you so much, Mayhill.
Thank you so much. Thank you for hosting me, and thank you everyone for coming. It was lovely to see you all, and so many of you I haven't seen in so long, and I can't wait till we can all hang out together in person.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.